Charles Manson didn't just manipulate people, he weaponized their deepest spiritual beliefs and twisted them into something absolutely terrifying. This guy took the Bible, mixed it with his own twisted fantasies, and created a religious nightmare that would haunt America forever. Manson's religious manipulation started with something that should have been sacred. He'd gather his followers around for what he called Bible study sessions, but these weren't your typical Sunday school meetings. Instead of teaching love and compassion, Manson zeroed in on the most apocalyptic, fear-inducing passages he could find, especially Revelation chapter 9. He'd read about scorpions tormenting the ungodly during God's wrath and tell his followers that these weren't just metaphors, they were real prophecies about what's coming. But here's where it gets really twisted. But before moving forward, please hit that like button right now if you can't believe how someone could corrupt faith so completely. And drop a comment below telling me which of these twisted religious leaders you think was the most dangerous. Now back to video where it get twisted. Manson convinced his family that the Beatles from Liverpool were actually these biblical scorpions. He'd point to the scripture describing creatures with hair like women and shining breastplates and say those were obviously electric guitars. It sounds completely insane, but remember, these people were isolated, drugged, and desperate for meaning in their lives. The most chilling part of Manson's religious corruption was how he positioned himself as a divine figure. This man literally claimed to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and he didn't just talk about it, he acted it out. Manson would stage mock crucifixions in front of his followers while they were tripping on LSD, making the whole experience feel supernaturally real. He'd stretch his arms out like Christ on the cross and tell them he was dying for their sins, then rise again to prove his divinity. Manson's connection to Scientology played a huge role in developing his Jesus complex. From 1961 to 1962, he spent 14 months studying Scientology, including past life regression sessions. These sessions likely convinced him that he really was Jesus in a past life, which became the foundation for his entire cult identity. It's terrifying how legitimate spiritual practices got twisted into something so dark. The way Manson used LSD as a religious sacrament shows just how far he'd fallen from any authentic spiritual path. He'd distribute acid to his followers like it was communion wine, telling them it would bring them closer to God and reveal divine truths. During these drug-fueled sessions, he'd orchestrate group orgies and present himself as the spiritual leader guiding them through their religious awakening. What should have been a sacred experience became a tool for control and abuse. Manson's interpretation of Helter Skelter demonstrates how he twisted popular culture into religious prophecy. He convinced his followers that the Beatles were speaking directly to him through their music, especially the song Helter Skelter. According to Manson, this wasn't just a rock song about a playground slide, it was God's message about an incoming race war that would destroy humanity. He told them he was Abaddon from Revelation, the destroyer who would lead the chosen ones to safety in the desert. The most evil aspect of Manson's religious manipulation was how he used fear to maintain absolute control. He created a constant atmosphere of paranoia by telling his followers that the outside world was filled with enemies who wanted to destroy them. Only he could protect them from the coming apocalypse. Only he had the divine knowledge to guide them through Helter Skelter. This fear-based control made them willing to do absolutely anything he commanded, including murder. Manson's ability to mix legitimate religious concepts with his own twisted ideology created a belief system that justified the most horrific acts. He took the idea of being chosen by God and turned it into a license for violence. His followers genuinely believed they were doing God's work when they committed those brutal murders in August of 1969. They left Helter Skelter written in blood on the walls because Manson convinced them it would trigger the biblical race war he'd prophesied. What makes Manson's story so chilling isn't just the murders, it's how he perverted something as sacred as faith itself. He took people's genuine spiritual hunger and fed them poison instead of truth. His followers weren't evil people, they were lost souls searching for meaning who got caught in the web of a master manipulator. Manson proves that when charismatic leaders exploit people's deepest spiritual needs, the results can be absolutely devastating. Jim Jones started out looking like any other preacher, but what he did with people's faith was absolutely diabolical. This man didn't just manipulate religion, he turned it into a weapon of mass destruction that would eventually claim 918 lives. Jones's first evil trick was his fake healing miracles, and they were elaborate productions that would make Hollywood jealous. He'd have his inner circle members dig through trash cans and break into people's homes to gather personal information, then use it during services to pretend he had divine knowledge. Picture this. Someone new walks into his church, and suddenly Jones knows their deepest secrets, their medical conditions, their family problems. But it gets worse. During his healing ceremonies, people would supposedly cough up cancerous tumors right in front of the congregation. His wife Marceline would then hold up these grotesque masses while everyone clapped and praised God. The truth was these were just pieces of rotten chicken liver and animal organs that Jones had planted. The most twisted part about Jones's religious deception was how he gradually moved his followers from Christianity to atheism while they thought they were getting closer to God. He started by claiming to be a prophet, then slowly convinced them he was God himself. Jones would tell his followers that traditional Christianity was just a tool to control people, and that he was revealing the real truth about spirituality. He called this apostolic socialism, mixing communist ideology with religious language to create something that sounded holy but was actually completely godless. Jones's control tactics were straight out of a psychological horror movie. He created a constant atmosphere of terror by telling his followers that enemies were everywhere trying to destroy them. First it was the Ku Klux Klan, then Nazis, then redneck vigilantes, and finally the entire American government. Jones would stage fake assassination attempts on his own life, pretending to survive by divine intervention. He'd tell people that terrible accidents, fires, and deaths would happen to anyone who left his protection. This created a prison of fear where people were too terrified to escape. The way Jones used sleep deprivation shows just how calculated his evil really was. Temple member Terry Buford O'Shea escaped and revealed Jones's strategy. Keep them poor and tired, because if they're poor they can't escape, and if they're tired they can't make plans. At Jonestown, loudspeakers blasted Jones's sermons 24 hours a day, preventing anyone from getting proper rest. After working manual labor from dawn to dusk on minimal food, followers would gather for evening sermons that lasted several hours. This deliberate exhaustion made them mentally vulnerable and unable to think clearly. Jones's punishment methods reveal the sadistic nature hiding behind his religious facade. He'd lock disobedient members in coffin-shaped boxes buried several feet underground while other followers were forced to constantly berate and humiliate them. He controlled every aspect of their lives, including who they could marry and sleep with. Jones would rape both male and female members of his congregation while claiming it was part of their spiritual development. He forced wives to have sex with him and coerced women to get abortions. The White Night rehearsals show how Jones turned religious ritual into rehearsals for mass murder. He'd gather everyone, including children, and make them drink what he claimed was poison. They'd wait 45 minutes expecting to die. Then Jones would reveal it was just a loyalty test. He'd warn them that soon they'd have to die by their own hands for real. These sick rehearsals conditioned people to accept their own deaths as a religious act. Jones's translation doctrine was perhaps his most evil religious manipulation. He convinced his followers that death wasn't really death, but translation to a higher spiritual plane where they'd all live together in bliss. This made mass suicide sound like a beautiful religious experience instead of murder. He twisted concepts of resurrection and eternal life to make people eager to die for him. What makes Jones so terrifying isn't just that he killed people, it's how he corrupted their deepest spiritual beliefs to do it. He took people who genuinely wanted to serve God and follow Christ, then slowly poisoned their faith until they couldn't tell the difference between good and evil. His followers thought they were part of a holy mission when they were actually trapped in hell on earth. Jones proves that when someone uses religious authority to exploit people's spiritual hunger, they can convince them to do absolutely anything, even drink poison and watch their children die. Gilles de Rais was Joan of Arc's trusted companion and Marshal of France, but after her death in 1431, this war hero became something absolutely monstrous. What he did next shows how someone can fall from the highest religious calling into the deepest pit of satanic evil. The transformation started when Gilles couldn't accept Joan's execution, and instead of turning to proper Christian mourning, he dove headfirst into the darkest occult practices imaginable. Around 1436, he began working with an Italian alchemist named Francesco Prelati, and together they turned his castle at Tiffauges into a chamber of horrors dedicated to summoning demons. They weren't just playing around with harmless magic tricks, they were conducting full-blown satanic rituals that would make your skin crawl. Gilles and Prelati drew magic circles in hidden chambers, burned mysterious offerings, and signed actual pacts with blood. But here's where it gets truly evil. They were trying to summon Satan himself, along with other demons like Beelzebub and Baron. These weren't desperate attempts by some poor peasant. This was a Marshal of France deliberately choosing to worship the devil. Gilles believed that by making deals with these infernal entities, he could restore his massive fortune and gain supernatural power. The most horrifying part of Gilles's satanic practices was how he used innocent children as sacrificial victims. Between 1432 and 1440, he systematically abducted, tortured, and murdered at least 140 children, though some estimates put the number much higher. But he didn't just kill them, he used their dismembered body parts in his demonic invocations. Witnesses testified that Prelati would take children's limbs and organs and incorporate them into their satanic rituals, believing this would please the demons they were trying to summon. Gilles had an entire network of accomplices helping him procure victims for his evil rituals. There was Perrine Martin, who would lure children to his castles under false pretenses. Eustache Blanchet, a corrupt priest, helped conduct the satanic ceremonies. They'd target poor families who wouldn't be missed, promising jobs or gifts to children before leading them to their deaths. One witness testified about hearing of a conduit filled with dead little children at his castle of Champtos. The ritualistic nature of these murders reveals just how far Gilles had fallen into satanic worship. After killing the children, he would dissect their bodies and derive sadistic pleasure from the acts. He wasn't just a serial killer, he was conducting elaborate ceremonies where children's deaths were offerings to demonic entities. The fact that he involved priests in these rituals shows how completely he'd corrupted religious practice and turned it into something satanic. What makes Gilles's story so chilling is how he maintained his public Christian facade while secretly practicing devil worship. During the day, he'd attend Mass and present himself as a nobleman, but at night he was summoning demons and sacrificing children. This double life lasted for years, with his accomplices helping him maintain the deception while they continued their horrific rituals. Gilles's arrest in September 1440 came after he violated ecclesiastical sanctuary by assaulting a priest, which finally gave authorities the excuse they needed to investigate him. During his trial, 49 articles of charges were read against him, detailing not just the murders but his heretical practices of invoking demons. The indictment specifically mentioned how he and his accomplices had murdered and shamefully tortured 140 children while committing heresy through demon invocation. Initially defiant during his trial, Gilles eventually confessed under the threat of torture, detailing his crimes in horrific specificity. He admitted to the first assaults occurring between spring 1432 and spring 1433, with the murders beginning at Champtos-sur-Loire before moving to Machecoul. His confession revealed the systematic nature of his evil, describing how he sodomized children before killing them. The trial records show that Gillis faced both ecclesiastical and civil proceedings. The ecclesiastical court condemned him for apostasy and heresy, while the civil court found him guilty of homicide. Throughout the proceedings, witnesses including parents and accomplices testified about the abductions and the satanic rituals that followed. Even as he faced execution, Gillis maintained that despite all his crimes, he had never sold his soul to the devil. He was sentenced to hanging and burning, bringing an end to one of history's most notorious examples of how religious faith can be utterly corrupted into satanic evil. Tomás de Torquemada took the sacred office of Grand Inquisitor and transformed it into something so twisted and evil that his name became synonymous with religious terror. When Pope Sixtus appointed him as Spain's first Grand Inquisitor in 1483, this Dominican friar didn't just investigate heresy, he turned Christianity itself into a weapon of mass psychological torture. Torquemada's evil genius lay in how he systematized religious persecution through his infamous 28 Articles. These weren't just guidelines, they were a blueprint for turning faith into absolute terror. He created detailed procedures for torture, interrogation, and execution that would make Satan himself proud. Under his twisted logic, anyone could be accused of heresy by just 2 witnesses, and once you were in his clutches, there was almost no escape. The torture methods Torquemada approved reveal just how far he'd fallen from Christian compassion. His favorite was the water cure, which is basically medieval waterboarding. They'd strip victims naked, tie them to a wooden ladder, clamp their jaws open with iron tongs, and then slowly pour water through a cloth down their throat until they felt like they were drowning. Torquemada claimed this was more merciful than other torture methods, but that's like saying getting stabbed is better than getting shot. Then there was the rack, or potro, where they'd stretch people until their joints dislocated. The strappado involved hoisting victims to the ceiling with their arms tied behind their backs, then dropping them violently without letting them hit the ground. Torquemada's instructions specifically stated that if victims died during torture, it was their own fault for being so stubborn about confessing. This man took the Christian concept of confession and turned it into a sadistic game where the only way to survive was to admit to crimes you probably didn't commit. But Torquemada's most diabolical innovation was the auto de fe, which literally means act of faith. These weren't just executions, they were elaborate theatrical productions designed to terrorize entire populations. Picture this: massive public spectacles with processions, sermons, and ceremonial readings of sentences, all designed to make people so afraid they'd never dare question the church's authority. The condemned would be paraded through the streets wearing yellow robes called sanbenitos, with pointed hats that made them look like demons. During Torquemada's 15-year reign of terror, he orchestrated the burning of approximately 2,000 people at the stake. But here's the truly evil part: even people who confessed and repented could still be executed. José Díaz Pimienta converted to Catholicism the night before his execution in 1720, received blessings from priests, and still got burned alive because Torquemada's system demanded blood regardless of genuine repentance. Torquemada's persecution of conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, shows how he corrupted the very concept of religious conversion. Instead of welcoming these new Christians with open arms like Christ would have done, Torquemada viewed them with suspicion and hatred. Ironically, his own grandparents were Jewish conversos, which makes his persecution even more twisted. Historians believe his extreme anti-Jewish fanaticism came from wanting to prove his Christian credentials by being more Catholic than the Catholics. The 1492 expulsion of all Jews from Spain represents Torquemada's ultimate corruption of Christian values. He convinced Ferdinand and Isabella that unbaptized Jews posed a spiritual threat to Christians, leading to the Alhambra Decree. This forced somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 Jews to choose between conversion or exile. Those who left lost everything they'd built over generations, while those who stayed lived in constant terror of being accused of secretly practicing Judaism. Torquemada expanded the Inquisition's scope far beyond traditional heresy to include crimes like blasphemy, usury, and even sorcery. This meant virtually any behavior could be interpreted as evidence of spiritual corruption. He created an atmosphere where neighbors would turn in neighbors, where children would denounce their parents, and where the mere accusation of heretical thoughts could destroy entire families. The psychological warfare Torquemada employed shows his truly satanic nature. The auto de fe ceremonies weren't just about punishing the guilty, they were about terrorizing the innocent. Even if someone had died or fled before their trial, Torquemada would burn their effigies in public to maintain the atmosphere of fear. This created a climate where people lived in constant dread, never knowing when they might be next. What makes Torquemada so evil isn't just the thousands he killed, it's how he perverted Christianity's message of love and forgiveness into something monstrous. He took Jesus's teachings about mercy and turned them into justification for torture, took the concept of salvation and made it dependent on political loyalty, and transformed houses of worship into centers of terror. Torquemada proves that when religious authority becomes corrupted by power and hatred, it can become more evil than anything Satan himself could devise. David Koresh didn't just lead the Branch Davidians, he completely warped their faith into something that would make the devil himself applaud. This man took the sacred role of spiritual teacher and turned it into a license for sexual abuse, violence, and psychological terrorism. Koresh's twisted religious manipulation started with his claim to be the Lamb of God mentioned in Revelation chapter 5. But here's where it gets absolutely sick. Instead of teaching love and redemption like Jesus did, Koresh used this identity to justify sleeping with married women in his congregation. He convinced his followers that as the Lamb, he was the only one worthy to break the 7 seals and reveal God's final message. This wasn't just spiritual arrogance, it was calculated evil designed to give him absolute control over every aspect of their lives. The most horrifying part of Koresh's religious corruption was how he used biblical polygamy to justify raping children. He twisted Old Testament stories about King David and other biblical figures to convince his followers that God wanted him to have multiple wives. But these weren't just adult women. Koresh was sexually abusing girls as young as 12 years old. He married a 12-year-old in 1987, a 14-year-old the same year, and a 13-year-old in 1989 who gave birth to his child when she was just 15. Koresh's justification for these crimes shows just how completely he'd perverted Christian doctrine. He taught his followers that children born from his unions would be sacred beings who would eventually rule the world as the house of David. This man convinced parents to hand over their daughters by claiming it was God's will for him to create a new lineage of divine children. Even survivor David Thibodeau admitted that of all the charges against Koresh, statutory rape was the one crime where he was definitely guilty and could have spent life in prison. The way Koresh used fear of the apocalypse to control his followers reveals his truly satanic nature. Starting in 1992, he began stockpiling massive amounts of weapons while preaching that the federal government were the Babylonians prophesied to destroy God's people. He didn't just teach about the end times. He created elaborate military drills where his followers practiced for the final battle. They'd sew special vests with pockets for ammunition clips and convert semi-automatic weapons to fully automatic. Koresh's paranoid teachings about law enforcement show how he turned legitimate biblical prophecy into dangerous delusions. He convinced his followers that ATF agents and FBI officers were literally the forces of Satan coming to kill them. This wasn't just spiritual metaphor. Koresh had his people genuinely believing that cooperating with authorities would damn their souls. He predicted the February 28th raid months before it happened, using it as proof of his prophetic powers when government agents actually showed up. But here's what makes Koresh so evil. He used his followers' genuine faith against them in the most manipulative ways possible. These weren't stupid people who got tricked. They were sincere believers who'd been studying biblical prophecy for decades. The Branch Davidians had been in the Waco area since 1935, and they followed Koresh because they genuinely believed he'd correctly interpreted the book of Revelation. He took that sincere spiritual hunger and poisoned it with his own twisted agenda. Koresh's control tactics included forcing married couples to divorce so he could claim their wives as his own spiritual brides. He convinced husbands that giving up their wives was an act of religious obedience, that God wanted all the women to belong to his chosen messenger. This wasn't just about sex, it was about destroying the most sacred human bonds and replacing them with loyalty to himself. Children grew up calling Koresh daddy while their biological fathers were reduced to mere followers. The most chilling aspect of Koresh's religious manipulation was how he prepared his followers for mass suicide while making them think it was martyrdom. He taught them that dying in battle against the government would guarantee their place in God's kingdom. During the 51-day siege, he continued preaching that their standoff with the FBI was the prophesied final battle between good and evil. When the compound caught fire on April 19, 1993, Koresh and 75 others died not as victims but as willing participants in what they believed was God's plan. What makes Koresh's story so terrifying isn't just the sexual abuse or the weapons stockpiling, it's how he corrupted every beautiful aspect of Christian faith. He took the concept of being chosen by God and turned it into an excuse for rape, took the idea of spiritual marriage and made it about control and abuse, and transformed hope for the second coming into preparation for mass murder. His followers weren't evil people, they were devout Christians who got caught in the web of someone who used their deepest beliefs to destroy them. Koresh proves that when religious authority becomes corrupted by lust and power, it can transform sacred faith into something more evil than anything found in hell itself. Before we continue with more of these absolutely terrifying cases, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. These dark histories of religious corruption don't get talked about enough. Grigory Rasputin took the sacred trust of spiritual healing and twisted it into something so corrupt that it brought down the entire Russian Empire. This man didn't just manipulate people's faith, he weaponized it to gain absolute power over the most powerful family in Russia. Rasputin's evil genius started with exploiting Tsarina Alexandra's desperate faith in God to save her son Alexei. When the young prince suffered from hemophilia and nearly died in 1908, Rasputin supposedly stopped the bleeding through prayer alone. But here's the twisted part. Rasputin timed his interventions perfectly, arriving just as Alexei's natural healing process was beginning. He turned medical coincidence into miraculous proof of his divine powers, making Alexandra believe he was literally sent by God. The most horrifying aspect of Rasputin's religious corruption was his connection to the KHLYST sect, a heretical group that mixed Christianity with sexual depravity. The KHLYSTY believed they could become closer to God by committing sins and then repenting for them. This wasn't just theological disagreement, it was Satan worship disguised as Christianity. They held orgies during religious gatherings, using lust and sex as supposed spiritual practices. Rasputin brought these demonic beliefs straight into the heart of Orthodox Russia. Rasputin's apartment in St. Petersburg became a center of religious perversion that would make the devil proud. His female followers would gather for what looked like innocent potluck dinners, but these meetings quickly turned into something absolutely twisted. Rasputin would sit at the head of the table in silence, then suddenly start mumbling and writing frantically on paper. His disciples believed these were divine revelations, but they were really just the ravings of a manipulative predator. The most disgusting part of Rasputin's spiritual corruption was how he convinced women that sexual contact with his body had healing powers. One follower, Olga Loktina, left her husband and children to live with him, forcing everyone to address him as God. Police surveillance revealed the horrific truth. Witnesses saw Olga holding Rasputin's penis while screaming that he was Christ. This wasn't just sexual abuse, it was blasphemy of the highest order. Rasputin's daily visits to bathhouses reveal the calculated evil behind his holy man facade. He'd hire prostitutes, take them to private rooms, and then beat them with his leather belt while claiming he was beating the sin out of their souls. After this sadistic ritual, he'd rape them and leave without ever touching the water. This man took the Christian concept of purification and turned it into an excuse for violence and sexual assault. Police surveillance documented how Rasputin accepted bribes and sexual favors while claiming to be a man of God. His apartment became a center for political corruption where government positions were bought and sold through spiritual manipulation. People believed they were making holy offerings when they were really just participating in the most corrupt form of political bribery. The way Rasputin intimidated his enemies shows his truly demonic nature. When Prime Minister Stolypin confronted him about being a fraud, Rasputin hypnotized him with what Stolypin described as an intimidating, evil glare. Days later, Stolypin was assassinated. Whether Rasputin was directly involved or not, the timing reveals the atmosphere of fear and supernatural dread he created around himself. Rasputin's influence over government appointments during World War I demonstrates how his spiritual manipulation threatened the entire nation. By 1914, major policy decisions required his approval before implementation. Military appointments, ministerial selections, and diplomatic initiatives couldn't proceed without consulting this Siberian mystic. Russia was literally being governed by someone whose qualifications came from fake healing abilities rather than governmental experience. YouTube. The most evil aspect of Rasputin's religious corruption was how he used the royal family's genuine faith against them. Nicholas and Alexandra weren't stupid or gullible. They were devout Orthodox Christians who desperately wanted to save their son. Rasputin took that pure parental love and twisted it into a tool for political control. Every time they questioned his behavior, he'd remind them that he'd saved Alexei's life, making them feel guilty for doubting God's chosen messenger. What makes Rasputin so terrifying isn't just his personal depravity, it's how he corrupted an entire empire's faith. His scandals didn't just destroy individual lives, they made the Russian people lose faith in their government and their church. Political cartoons portrayed him as a hypnotist or magician controlling the throne from behind the scenes. The secrecy surrounding his palace visits only strengthened public belief that this corrupt mystic had supernatural power over their rulers. Rasputin proves that when someone uses genuine spiritual gifts for evil purposes, they can destroy not just individual souls but entire civilizations. His legacy shows how easily sacred faith can be perverted into something more dangerous than any political revolution or military invasion. T.B. Joshua turned his synagogue church of all nations into a house of horrors where faith became a weapon of torture and sexual abuse spanning nearly 20 years. This Nigerian megachurch leader didn't just manipulate people's beliefs, he created an entire system of religious terror that destroyed hundreds of lives while broadcasting fake miracles to millions worldwide. The most evil aspect of T.B. Joshua's religious corruption was how he systematically faked his healing miracles to build a global empire of deception. Former church insiders revealed that Joshua would plant actors in his congregation who pretended to be sick or disabled. These fake patients would arrive on stretchers or in wheelchairs, then miraculously walk during his services while cameras captured every moment. But here's the twisted part. Joshua's inner circle would research attendees beforehand, gathering personal information that he'd use during services to convince people he had divine knowledge. Joshua's medical certificate scam reveals just how calculated his evil really was. The healing miracles broadcast to millions regularly included fake medical reports claiming people had been cured of HIV, AIDS, and cancer. He'd have doctors interviewed on camera confirming these supposed cures, but journalist investigations proved these certificates were completely fabricated. Former disciple Paul described Joshua as an evil genius who masterminded every aspect of this religious manipulation. But the fake healings were just the beginning of Joshua's satanic practices. Inside his secretive Lagos compound, he systematically raped and tortured dozens of followers, many of whom were teenagers when they first arrived. British survivor Ray spent 12 years as a disciple, enduring sexual assault, solitary confinement, and becoming so desperate she attempted suicide. Multiple women reported being repeatedly raped by Joshua for years, with one victim claiming she was forced to have 5 abortions after becoming pregnant from his assaults. Joshua's fishing department shows how he turned recruitment into a predatory hunting system. He ordered his most trusted disciples to identify virgin girls from the congregation specifically so he could sexually assault them. Former disciple Basola admitted that Joshua asked her to recruit virgins for him so he could bring them into the disciple fold and rape them. She participated because of both indoctrination and threats of violence, while she herself was repeatedly raped by Joshua. The physical torture methods Joshua used reveal his truly demonic nature. Dozens of eyewitnesses described him whipping and chaining followers who disobeyed his commands. Any infringement that Joshua deemed disobedient was met with vicious physical assault. He developed a habit of slapping, hitting, and brutally flogging his subjects. Former disciples described the compound as operating like a cult where at least 150 residents lived under conditions of physical abuse, sleep deprivation, and torture. Joshua's secret abortion clinic demonstrates the depth of his evil. One room within his building was secretly converted into an abortion facility where his numerous rape victims were subjected to unsafe and non-consensual procedures. Medical professionals would insert unregulated objects into women's genitalia to extract fetuses without proper medical care or consent. This wasn't just sexual abuse, it was systematic medical torture disguised as religious practice. The 2014 building collapse reveals how Joshua prioritized his reputation over human life. When a structure housing pilgrims collapsed and killed at least 116 people, Joshua blocked emergency services from accessing the site for hours. Church insiders claim lives could have been saved if he'd responded promptly, but instead he focused on covering up his role in the disaster. He was charged with criminal negligence but refused to attend court, showing his complete disregard for legal accountability. Joshua's psychological control methods show how he weaponized faith itself. Survivors described living in constant fear, never knowing when they might be selected for punishment or assault. He created an atmosphere where questioning his authority meant risking physical violence or being kicked out with nowhere to go. Many disciples had been living in the compound for decades, making them completely dependent on Joshua for basic survival. What makes Joshua's story so horrific is how he maintained his public image as a holy man while committing these atrocities. His television network Emmanuel TV broadcast his fake miracles to millions across Europe, the Americas, Southeast Asia, and Africa. His YouTube channel accumulated hundreds of millions of views while he was secretly running a torture compound. He paraded himself as the second coming of Jesus Christ while systematically destroying the lives of his most devoted followers. The most chilling aspect of Joshua's religious corruption was how he used people's genuine faith against them. His victims weren't gullible or weak, they were sincere believers who wanted to serve God and help others. Joshua took that pure spiritual desire and perverted it into something absolutely satanic. Even after his death in 2021, survivors are still struggling to rebuild their lives after years of systematic abuse disguised as religious devotion. Anton LaVey didn't worship the devil like a traditional Satanist, but what he did was arguably even more twisted because he used the fear of Satan to manipulate people while laughing at them behind their backs. This man admitted he lied constantly, incessantly, and operated by conning the rubes, turning religious theater into a calculated scheme for personal power and control. LaVey's most evil trait was how he preached personal freedom while micromanaging every aspect of his followers' lives. According to Church of Satan priest Gavin Baddeley, LaVey pontificated about the sacred importance of individual liberty, but as a leader he controlled his disciples like puppets. This wasn't just hypocrisy, it was psychological warfare disguised as spiritual enlightenment. The testimony from LaVey's own daughter Zena reveals the horrifying reality behind his public persona. On April 30, 1990, Zena formally renounced any association with her father, whom she now called her unfather. She testified against him in court, describing how his behavior destroyed their family. After decades of first-hand experience, Zena concluded that LaVeyan Satanism was really just dark triad personality disorder with cosplay and ritual fetishes. LaVey's connections to Nazi groups show how he weaponized fear and hatred for his own agenda. He maintained cordial relationships with fascist leader James Madole of the National Renaissance Party, frequently meeting at NRP offices. LaVey never endorsed nor rejected these white supremacist connections, using the Nazi aesthetic to keep his image suitably sinister. Newsweek magazine noted that if anything was fundamentally diabolic about LaVey, it came more from echoes of Nazism in his theories than from horror comic trappings. The Satanic Bible itself promotes a philosophy that's genuinely evil in its selfishness and cruelty. LaVey wrote that Satanism is a blatantly selfish, brutal religion based on the belief that humans are inherently violent. He taught that there's no altruism or love thy neighbor concept except for helping other Satanists gain their desires through group energy. This wasn't spiritual philosophy, it was a manual for psychological manipulation disguised as religious doctrine. LaVey's ritual practices were designed as psychodramas to break down people's psychological defenses. His black masses included nude women used as altars, creating an atmosphere where normal moral boundaries dissolved. These ceremonies weren't just theatrical performances, they were calculated to make participants abandon their previous ethical frameworks and submit to LaVey's authority. He knew exactly what he was doing when he created elaborate rituals that mixed sex, shock, and religious symbolism. The authoritarian control LaVey exercised over his followers created multiple schisms within his church. Former associates described how people either blindly followed his every command or eventually broke with him completely. Michael Aquino, who founded the Temple of Set after leaving LaVey, became obsessed with exposing his former mentor's corruption. LaVey organized followers into grottos, essentially satanic parishes where he maintained absolute control over their spiritual and personal lives. LaVey's support for eugenics and social Darwinism reveals the truly dangerous ideology behind his theatrical Satanism. He believed eugenics would be necessary for humanity's future, promoting the idea that some people were naturally superior to others. This wasn't just philosophical speculation, it was hate disguised as intellectual discourse. Combined with his fascist connections, LaVey's teachings created a framework where cruelty and discrimination became religious virtues. What makes LaVey particularly evil is how he corrupted people's genuine spiritual seeking. His followers weren't looking for Satan worship, they were searching for personal freedom and authentic spirituality. LaVey took that sincere desire for liberation and turned it into something that made them worse people. Zena testified that occult groups like her father's often lead to worse manipulation, abuse, and suffering than conventional religions. Levy's marketing genius lay in balancing 9 parts respectability with 1 part outrageousness. This formula allowed him to attract mainstream attention without frightening off potential followers. But underneath the theatrical showmanship was someone who genuinely believed in promoting selfishness, cruelty, and authoritarianism. He used people's fascination with forbidden knowledge to recruit them into a system that made them psychologically dependent on his approval. The most twisted aspect of Levy's religious manipulation was how he made evil seem intellectual and sophisticated. By presenting Satanism as atheistic philosophy rather than devil worship, he gave people permission to embrace their worst impulses while feeling smart about it. His followers thought they were becoming enlightened freethinkers when they were really just learning to be more selfish and cruel. Levy proves that you don't need to believe in the devil to spread genuine evil. You just need charisma, showmanship, and a willingness to exploit people's deepest psychological needs for your own twisted purposes. Jeffrey Lundgren took his position as a lay minister in the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and transformed it into something absolutely diabolical. This man didn't just preach false doctrine, he used people's genuine faith to justify mass murder while claiming he was doing God's work. Lundgren's evil genius started with his twisted interpretation of chiasmus, a biblical writing pattern found in Scripture. He convinced his followers that he discovered secret messages hidden in the Bible that only he could decode. This wasn't just creative Bible study, it was calculated manipulation designed to make him the only source of divine truth. His chiasmus method involved searching texts for recurring patterns, but Lundgren used this to create whatever interpretation served his twisted agenda. The most horrifying aspect of Lundgren's religious corruption was how he gradually isolated his followers from mainstream Christianity. He started offering Bible study services at his home where he completely dominated the sessions and intimidated anyone who disagreed with his teachings. If someone questioned his authority, Lundgren would encourage other followers to intimidate the doubter until they submitted. This created an atmosphere where questioning his divine authority became literally dangerous. Lundgren's financial manipulation shows just how completely he corrupted the concept of religious offering. He convinced his supporters that giving him money was essential for their salvation, and some followers handed over their entire life savings calculated to be thousands of dollars. This wasn't just greed, it was spiritual extortion where people believed their eternal souls depended on funding his lifestyle. He used their faith in God to line his own pockets while claiming every dollar was divinely ordained. The way Lundgren positioned himself as God's final prophet reveals his truly satanic nature. He didn't just claim to hear God's voice, he insisted he was more than a prophet and that the second coming of Christ couldn't happen without his leadership. Defense lawyers later admitted that Lundgren had completely lost touch with reality, believing his own lies about divine communication. But the evidence showed he knew exactly what he was doing when he used religious authority to manipulate his followers. Lundgren's treatment of the Avery family demonstrates how he weaponized faith against the most vulnerable. Dennis Avery had been a devoted follower who brought his wife Cheryl and their 3 daughters Trina, Rebecca, and Karen to join Lundgren's group. But when Dennis began questioning Lundgren's increasingly radical teachings, this supposed man of God decided the entire family needed to die. He told his followers that God had personally commanded him to murder them. The calculated evil behind the Avery murders shows Lundgren's complete corruption of Christian leadership. On April 10, 1989, he ordered cult members to dig a pit 6 feet by 7 feet by 4 feet to hide the bodies. He spent a week planning every detail while continuing to preach about love and salvation. On April 17, he moved all the Avery possessions to his farmhouse and told the family they were going on a wilderness excursion to see God. The dinner party Lundgren hosted before the murders reveals his twisted manipulation of Christian fellowship. He invited the Avries for what appeared to be a normal community meal, using the sacred act of breaking bread together as a setup for mass murder. After dinner, he led the family members one by one to the barn where he'd prepared their execution site. He made Dennis watch his family die, then killed 7-year-old Karen last while her siblings' bodies lay nearby. Lundgren's use of a chainsaw to muffle gunshots shows his calculated cruelty. This wasn't a crime of passion or religious delusion, it was premeditated murder disguised as divine obedience. He bound each victim with duct tape and shot them execution-style while other cult members operated power tools to hide the sounds. The methodical nature of these killings proves Lundgren knew exactly how evil his actions were. What makes Lundgren's story so terrifying is how he maintained his prophet persona even during his trial. He testified that talking to God wasn't his imagination and that he deserved special treatment because of his divine calling. Even facing the death penalty, he continued using religious language to justify murdering an entire family, including 3 children. His final words before execution were religious platitudes about love and family, showing he never took responsibility for corrupting faith itself. Lundgren proves that when someone uses genuine religious authority for evil purposes, they can convince sincere believers to participate in absolutely horrific acts. His followers weren't evil people, they were devout Christians who trusted their spiritual leader. He took their pure desire to serve God and perverted it into something that enabled child murder. The Avery family died because they believed in following religious authority, making Lundgren's crimes not just murder but spiritual terrorism designed to destroy faith itself. Nazón Joaquín Garcia turned the sacred role of spiritual leader into something so twisted that federal prosecutors called it an international sex trafficking enterprise disguised as a church. This man didn't just corrupt faith, he weaponized it to create a multi-generational system of abuse that spans across continents. Garcia's evil genius lies in how he exploited the absolute devotion that La Luz del Mundo teaches toward its apostle. Members of this church are raised from birth to believe that the apostle is literally God's chosen messenger on earth, and questioning or disobeying him leads to eternal damnation. Garcia took this sacred trust and perverted it into a license for sexual abuse, teaching children that serving his twisted desires was actually serving God. The most horrifying aspect of Garcia's religious manipulation was how he groomed victims from childhood using church doctrine. Federal prosecutors revealed that he selected teenagers to abuse under the guise of church activities, teaching congregants from birth that they would be eternally damned if they didn't obey his sexual demands. This wasn't just spiritual manipulation, it was calculated psychological warfare designed to make children believe that being raped was their religious duty. Garcia's systematic approach to abuse shows the calculated evil behind his religious facade. He maintained a close circle of co-conspirators who facilitated his abuse of teens and young women, directing them to produce child sex videos for his gratification. Court documents reveal that he engaged in what prosecutors called depraved and unspeakable acts against minor boys and girls, including rape, forced incest, and sadistic sexual rituals. The international scope of Garcia's trafficking operation reveals how he used church resources for evil. Prosecutors allege that he and his associates trafficked victims on international trips to Asia, Europe, Africa, Mexico, and the United States, using these young people to help smuggle money while forcing them into sexual servitude. This man turned church missions into opportunities for child exploitation. Garcia's control methods demonstrate how he weaponized religious authority. He directed many victims to live in his homes in Guadalajara, Mexico, and Los Angeles, California, where they were completely under his control. These children and young women were told that serving the apostle would lead to religious blessings, while resistance meant ostracization from family and friends within the church community. The generational nature of Garcia's abuse shows how deeply he corrupted the church's foundation. Federal indictments accuse not just Garcia but also his deceased father and grandfather of similar crimes, suggesting that this pattern of abuse has been the church's dark secret for decades. Former member Sokol Martin filed a federal lawsuit claiming she was groomed from childhood to serve as a sex slave to both Garcia and his father Samuel. Garcia's use of church doctrine to silence victims reveals his truly satanic manipulation of faith. Many victims have been raised in families that belonged to La Luz del Mundo for generations, making them completely dependent on the church for their identity and relationships. Garcia exploited this dependency by teaching that leaving the church would mean losing all family connections and facing eternal punishment. The evidence against Garcia includes massive amounts of electronic proof of his crimes. During raids in 2025, authorities seized over 24 electronic devices containing photos and videos of child sex abuse. This digital evidence shows that Garcia didn't just abuse children, he documented it for his own twisted pleasure. Garcia's continued influence from prison demonstrates how deeply he's corrupted his followers' faith. Even while serving a 16-year sentence for sexually abusing minors, church members still worship him as God's apostle. They sing songs celebrating his leadership and refuse to believe the overwhelming evidence against him. The church's response to Garcia's crimes shows how religious manipulation creates willful blindness. Despite his guilty plea to sexually abusing underage girls and the mountain of evidence against him, millions of followers worldwide continue to view him as their spiritual leader. This demonstrates how effectively Garcia poisoned their ability to distinguish between good and evil. What makes Garcia so terrifying isn't just the scale of his crimes, but how he perverted the most sacred aspects of Christianity. He took concepts like apostolic authority, religious devotion, and spiritual blessing and turned them into weapons for child abuse. His victims weren't just physically harmed, they were spiritually destroyed by someone who convinced them that rape was worship and abuse was obedience to God. Garcia proves that when religious authority becomes completely corrupted, it can create a hell on earth where children are taught to thank their abuser for destroying their innocence. That wraps up our countdown of the 10 most evil people who turned faith into fear. If these stories left you wanting more disturbing religious history, click on the video I'm showing on screen right now about the most evil massacres in America by teenagers. Don't forget to subscribe. Tell in comments which religious manipulator shocked you the most. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next terrifying episode.